What would you do if the person who was supposed to love you unconditionally stood up in front of 12 strangers and called you a thief? Not a disappointment, not a failure, a thief. I want you to sit with that for a second because that is exactly where my story begins. My name is Claire Whitmore. I am 43 years old, and on a gray Tuesday morning in Hartford, Connecticut, I sat in a courtroom that smelled of floor wax and cold coffee, while my father systematically tried to erase everything I had ever been. The Whitmore name carried weight in New England. My father, Richard, quote, had built one of the most respected medical research foundations in the region, a man whose handshake could open hospital doors and whose opinion shaped which studies got funded and which families were considered respectable. Growing up, I worked in his laboratory from the age of 12. Not as a child playing scientist. As someone who understood protein chains before most kids understood algebra, but in our house, brilliance without visibility meant nothing. And I was never visible enough for Richard Whitmore. So, at 28, I left. The explanation I gave my family was simple: international consulting work. They nodded, accepted it, and never asked a single follow-up question. For 15 years, I existed to them as a rumor, a ghost, a daughter who had chosen to disappear rather than carry the family name forward the way Richard had always expected. 3 years ago, my mother Margaret was diagnosed with a progressive memory disorder. She spent her final months in a world that grew smaller every week until even the faces she had loved most became strangers to her. She passed quietly, and when her attorney read the terms of her will, there was a clause no one had anticipated, a requirement that Claire Whitmore's employment history be formally verified before any distribution of the estate could proceed. My mother had written that clause herself. At the time, I did not fully understand why. I would. Richard filed suit within the week. The accusation was clean and surgical. Forged signatures on withdrawal documents, thousands of dollars drained from Margaret's personal accounts to fund, in his words, a life in another city that Claire could not afford on her own. The courtroom on the morning of the hearing had the particular stillness of a room that knows something is about to break. The fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency just below conscious hearing. The wooden benches creaked as spectators settled. I could feel the weight of 12 pairs of eyes from the jury box like a physical pressure on my chest. I sat straight. My spine pressed against the hard back of the witness chair the way it had pressed against the walls of windowless briefing rooms on 3 different continents. I wrapped both hands around the heavy crystal glass in front of me and let the cold travel up through my palms. The water was clear and tasteless, exactly like the evidence waiting inside Daniel Hargrove's briefcase on the table to my left. Richard rose to his feet. His face had gone the color of old brick. He lifted a manila folder and swept it toward the jury like a flag claiming conquered territory. His voice filled the room with the practiced authority of a man who had never once been told he was wrong. "She has not worked a single day since college," he said. "And now she is stealing from her own dead mother." I did not flinch. I did not turn. I raised the crystal glass and took one slow, deliberate sip. The water was ice cold. I set the glass down without a sound, and I watched my father perform his certainty for 12 people who had no idea that everything he believed about this moment was about to collapse. He did not know what was inside the sealed black envelope in Daniel Hargrove's briefcase. Not yet. Richard did not stop at the opening statement. He was just getting started. He moved through the courtroom the way he had always moved through every room he entered, like the space belonged to him, and everyone else was a guest he had not yet decided to remove. He told the jury about the foundation he had built, the hospital wings he had funded, the research grants that bore the Whitmore name. He painted himself as a pillar of the community who had done everything right and been repaid with betrayal. His investigators had spent 6 months building a file on me. 6 months. And after all of that, The best they could produce was a thin paper trail connected to a mid-level international consulting firm called Meridian, a company so deliberately unremarkable that it barely registered in any public database. To Richard, that absence of information was proof of my failure. He told the jury I had spent 15 years chasing nothing and had come home only when there was money to take. Then Gerald Hutchins, Richard's attorney, turned toward me. He was a man who wore his confidence like an expensive suit, tailored, immovable, and designed to intimidate. He approached the witness stand slowly and asked, in the kind of voice that is meant to make a room feel small, "Miss Whitmore, can you explain to this jury why there is not a single federal tax record filed under your name in the past 12 years?" The courtroom went quiet. Every juror leaned slightly forward. I looked at him steadily, and I said nothing. I simply offered the faintest suggestion of a smile. Not defiant, not nervous, patient. Hutchins held my gaze for a moment, then turned away as if my silence had already confirmed everything he needed. Several jurors nodded. I watched them do it. Then Natalie took the stand. My younger sister entered that room the way she had always entered important rooms as a performance. She was wearing a black silk dress that moved quietly against the floor, and her eyes were carefully made up to carry just the right amount of grief. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a practiced tremble soft enough to seem genuine, loud enough to reach the back row. She told the jury that I had always made the family feel inadequate, that while she was the one sitting beside our mother during those last terrible months, holding her hand as Margaret forgot the faces of the people she loved most, I was somewhere else, unreachable, indifferent, absent. Then she reached into her bag and produced a stack of bank statements. 14 withdrawals from Margaret's personal account, over 18 months, $43,000. The signatures, Natalie said, her voice breaking on cue, did not look like their mother's handwriting. That was when juror number 7, a middle-aged woman in the second row, turned and looked directly at me. The suspicion in her eyes was not subtle. I felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees, and then I noticed it. On Natalie's wrist, catching the fluorescent light as she gestured toward the documents, a gold watch with a brushed metal face. I recognized it immediately. 2 years ago, I had transferred the exact purchase price through an anonymous scholarship account as a birthday gift. She was wearing my silence on her wrist while accusing me of theft. The anger I felt in that moment was not hot. It was cold, cold and precise. The way a scalpel is precise, not destructive, but exact. Because here is what Natalie did not tell the jury. Those $43,000 were not stolen. They were payments made quietly, routed through an intermediary account that could never be traced back to my name for the 3 private nurses who cared for Margaret around the clock during the final 18 months of her life. Richard had refused to allow outside caregivers into the house. He called it a matter of privacy. He called it protecting the family's dignity. Even as my mother stood in the hallway of her own home and could not remember which door led to her bedroom. I paid for those nurses from overseas, from behind layers of documentation that were designed to be invisible. I did not do it for gratitude. I did it because Margaret deserved better than the world Richard had built around her. They had constructed what looked like a perfect case. Every brick was in place, every angle was covered. What they did not know, what neither of them had any reason to suspect, was that the foundation beneath all of it had already begun to crack. Gerald Hutchins walked back to his seat with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed the verdict was already written. He had not quite settled into his chair when Daniel Hargrove stood up. There was no theatrics in the way Daniel moved. He was built like a man who had spent decades in rooms where composure was not optional, broad-shouldered, measured, wearing a charcoal gray suit without a single crease out of place. He did not pace. He did not perform. He simply reached into his briefcase, and placed one object on the defense table, a thick black envelope, sealed with deep crimson wax, embossed with the gold eagle insignia of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the kind of document that does not appear in ordinary courtrooms, the kind that, when it does appear, changes the temperature of the room immediately. A low murmur moved through the jury box, like a current. Across the room, the smirk that had lived on Richard's face all morning flickered just slightly like a candle catching a draft. Gerald Hutchins was on his feet before Daniel could speak. "Objection, Your Honor. This document was not produced during discovery. The defense cannot introduce materials deliberately withheld from the plaintiff's legal team." His voice carried the edge of a man who felt the ground shifting and was trying to stop it with words. Daniel turned toward him slowly, the way a person turns when they are not remotely concerned. "That is precisely the point, Mr. Hutchins. This document was exempt from standard discovery protocols under Title 10, Section 144 of federal law due to its national security classification. It was filed under protective seal and pre-authorized for judicial review only." The courtroom went very still. Richard leaned toward Gerald and said in a voice he thought was quiet enough, "What does that mean? What is that?" Gerald said nothing. For the first time since the hearing began, Richard Whitmore did not have an answer waiting for him. Judge Harold Bennett accepted the envelope with both hands. He was 61 years old. A former Air Force colonel, who had spent 2 decades reading classified documents in underground facilities, a man who knew exactly what certain insignias meant. He broke the seal carefully, read the single page inside, then read it again. He removed his glasses and set them on the bench. 4 full seconds of silence passed. Then his eyes moved not to Daniel, not to Richard, but directly to the silver pin on the lapel of my jacket, the silver caduceus emblem of the Interagency Biodefense Task Force. His expression did not change. But something behind his eyes did. "Mr. Hargrove," Bennett said, his voice dropping to a register I had only ever heard in secure briefing rooms. "I need complete silence in this courtroom." He waited until the last whisper died. Then he looked out at the room, at Richard, at the jury, at the gallery full of colleagues who had spent decades treating Richard Whitmore like a man beyond reproach, and he began to speak. He told them the blank spaces in my record were not evidence of laziness or fraud or a life poorly lived. He told them that for 15 years I had served as a senior director of operations within the international intelligence community, specializing in the identification and containment of biological threats to national security. He told them that the Meridian consulting firm Richard's investigators had mocked as a dead-end job was a carefully constructed civilian cover maintained at the highest levels of federal authorization. The gaps in my file were not proof of my failure, they were proof of my clearance. The silence that followed lasted only a moment before breaking into something ungovernable, voices rising from the gallery. A sharp intake of breath from juror number 7, the sound of Richard's chair scraping hard against the floor as he shifted like a man trying to find solid ground. I did not look at my father. I did not look at Natalie. I looked straight ahead and let the truth fill the room the way light fills a space when someone finally opens the door. For the first time in 21 years, I was seen. Not by my family, by the facts. But this was not the final blow. Because what Richard feared most was never losing a lawsuit. What Richard feared most was the truth about where his empire had actually come from, and that truth was still sitting in Daniel Hargrove's briefcase, waiting. The room had barely absorbed what Judge Bennett had just revealed when Daniel Hargrove reached into his briefcase a second time. The gallery was still murmuring. Richard sat rigid in his chair, jaw set, hands flat on the table, the posture of a man trying hard to look composed, while something underneath was beginning to give way. Daniel set a second file on the defense table, thicker than the first, and let it sit there for 2 full seconds before he spoke. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying that same unhurried calm, "since the plaintiff raised the issue of my client's contributions to this community, we would like to address the true origin of the patents currently sustaining the Whitmore Medical Research Foundation." Richard's hands, which had been so still a moment before, began to tremble. Between 2017 and 2022, while stationed at a secure facility in Northern Virginia, I developed 4 separate medical breakthroughs related to low-cost vaccine delivery systems for high-risk outbreak regions. These were not theoretical proposals. They were fully documented, field-tested methodologies that could have reduced the cost of essential vaccines by up to 80% across parts of Africa and Southeast Asia regions where preventable diseases were still killing children by the thousands. I believed, perhaps with more faith than the evidence warranted, that if I sent those findings to Richard's research group through an anonymous intermediary, he would use his platform to put them into the world. So I did. Every one of them. Without my name. Without any expectation of credit. Because I still believed, somewhere beneath 15 years of silence, that my father was capable of doing something genuinely good with what I gave him. Instead, Richard filed for patents under his own name within 3 weeks of receiving each submission. He licensed the intellectual property to 2 major pharmaceutical corporations, and over 5 years collected more than $18 million from those agreements. The delivery system that could have made vaccines affordable for millions of people was locked behind a pricing structure that ensured it would never reach the people it was designed to save. He did not just take my name, he took the health of people who would never know my name existed. Daniel placed the time-stamped server logs on the bench original records from a secured federal system, cross-referenced line by line against Richard's patent filing dates. Every submission, every registration. 3 weeks apart, without a single exception. The correlation was not a coincidence. It was a pattern. Richard stared at the documents and then, before Gerald Hutchins could reach for his arm, he stood up and pointed directly at me, his voice finally breaking through the surface of his composure. "You cannot prove that. No court in this country would ever—" The gavel came down like a gunshot. "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Bennett said, his quiet authority more frightening than any shout. "Sit down, right now." Richard sat. The room went silent. I looked at Natalie. She was no longer performing. She was staring at Richard with an expression I had never seen on her before, not grief, not sympathy, but the cold arithmetic of someone calculating how far the damage was going to reach. The alliance between them had just fractured in full view of everyone in that room. Daniel closed the file and delivered his final words in the same level tone he had used throughout. "Your Honor, we filed a formal complaint of fraudulent inventorship with the United States Patent and Trademark Office this morning. This is no longer a civil estate dispute. What the plaintiff has committed constitutes federal fraud, and what he stated under oath in this courtroom today constitutes perjury." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The words landed the way true things always land, without drama, without decoration, with the simple and devastating weight of facts that cannot be undone. Richard Whitmore, the man who had spent 4 decades building a cathedral of reputation in this city, sat in his chair and looked like a man watching the walls come down around him. And now it was time for Judge Bennett to place the final stone. Judge Bennett did not wait for closing arguments. The gavel came down once clean and final, like a door closing on everything Richard Whitmore had spent the morning trying to build. He dismissed the complaint with prejudice. He issued sanctions against Richard in the amount of $52,000 for malicious litigation brought in bad faith against an officer of the federal government. He awarded me $120,000 in damages for defamation of character, to be drawn directly from Richard's share of the estate. Then Bennett set down his notes and looked at my father without anger, only with the quiet weight of a man who recognized genuine service and knew when it had been treated as worthless. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "you stood in this courtroom and deliberately attempted to destroy the reputation of a woman who spent 15 years protecting this country. I hope you understand the full weight of what you chose to do today." Richard said nothing. Natalie sat perfectly still beside him, hands folded, the performance gone from her face entirely. Everything she had counted on as a guaranteed outcome had just become a liability. I walked out of the witness chair without slowing down, moving the way I had always moved, through difficult rooms with purpose, and completely beyond the reach of anyone who had tried to reduce me. I was nearly at the door when I heard it. Richard's voice, thin now, stripped of every trace of the authority that had once filled every room he entered. "Claire." I stopped. I did not turn. "We didn't know," he said. "How were we supposed to know?" I stood still for one breath, then spoke just quietly enough for only him to hear. "The $43,000 from Margaret's account, that was me paying for her nurses while you refused to let anyone through the door. The $310,000 that kept this foundation from federal seizure in 2022? That was me too. I didn't do it for the Whitmore name. I did it because Margaret deserved better than the world you built around her. But that debt is settled now." I walked out without looking back. Behind me, the murmur of the gallery rose, the sound of people who had respected Richard Whitmore for decades, beginning to recalculate everything they thought they knew. Outside, the Hartford morning was cool and clean, carrying the faint smell of wet grass after a night of rain. Daniel met me at the bottom of the courthouse steps and handed me my briefcase. "The director wants a debrief at 7 tomorrow," he said. He said, "You handled it well." I looked out at the street ahead. "I was just balancing the books, Daniel." In my car, I unclipped the silver caduceus pin from my lapel, the emblem of 15 years, lived in the margins of other people's awareness, and placed it into its small black velvet case. I had already begun the paperwork for the Margaret Foundation, a fund to support medical professionals and investigators being silenced by the very institutions they served. My mother had spent her life watching quietly. This was my way of making that watching matter. I spent 15 years making myself smaller to fit a story my family had written for me. What I know now is, your worth does not require anyone's recognition to exist. Do not waste your energy trying to change how people who have already decided choose to see you. Build a life so full and so purposeful that their version of you can no longer reach you. Have you ever had to choose between staying silent to protect someone else, or speaking up to protect yourself? Share your story in the comments. You are not alone in it.